Greetings, viewers! It's story time within Otter words, and I wanted to introduce you to a very short story that I remember vividly from my childhood. It comes from William Bennett's Book of Virtues, and I will now read it in full. Don't get up, it'll only be a minute or two. Ahem. The Leopard's Revenge. Once a leopard cub strayed from his home and ventured into the midst of a great herd of elephants. His mother and father had warned him to stay out of the way of the giant beasts, but he did not listen. Suddenly, the elephants began to stampede, and one of them stepped on the cub without even knowing it, and soon afterward, a hyena found his body and went to tell his parents. "I have terrible news," he said. "I found your son lying dead in the field." The mother and father leopard gave great cries of grief and rage. "How did it happen?" the father demanded. "Tell me who did this to our son. I will never rest until I have my revenge." "The elephants did it," answered the hyena. "The elephants?" asked the father leopard, quite startled. "You say it was the elephants?" "Yes," said the hyena. "I saw their tracks." The leopard paced back and forth for a few minutes, growling and shaking his head. "No, you were wrong," he said at last. "It was not the elephants. It was the goats. The goats have murdered my boy." And at once he bounded down the hill and sprang upon a herd of goats grazing in the valley below, and in a violent rage killed as many as he could in revenge. The end. Okay, everyone, let's talk about terrorism. How long does the shadow of the Twin Towers reach? Well, for many people, it reaches as far as the border between Mexico and the U.S., especially with regards to, of all things, immigration. Michelle Malkin, you focused much of your career on limiting immigration. What got you interested in this topic?
The first book I wrote was prompted by living through 9/11.
J.D. Hayworth, what made you change your mind about militarizing the Mexican border? For almost my entire career, I resisted the notion of putting troops along our border, but September 11th and the growing border violence have changed my mind. And this connection between terrorism and immigration isn't limited just to popular pundits and elected representatives. Charging unauthorized immigrants with trespassing is unusual and, as it turns out, unconstitutional. What made you take this approach, Officer Chamberlain? I'm just saying, wait a minute, we're on heightened alert, and it's post 9/11, and I'm going to let an illegal immigrant who I don't know from Adam just walk away? Yeah, like he said, he can't let an illegal immigrant just walk away. It's post 9/11. It honestly seems to me as if these people saw the darkness and depravity of the September 11th attacks and thought, immigrants. Too many forget that all of the 11 hijackers on September 11th, 2001 were immigrants. With all due respect, no, none of them were. 3 of the 11 hijackers were overstaying their visas at the time of the attacks, but even calling just them immigrants is as silly as calling the rest tourists. Sometimes the search for connection between terrorism and immigration is so obtuse that trying to find it is like reading a detective mystery. Such was definitely the case when I read Chapter 7 of the book with my favorite title of all immigration books, In Mortal Danger. This chapter was very moving for me to get through because it recounts the terrifying 2004 terror attacks in Beslan, Russia, which I vividly remember following in real time as it played out. I was intrigued to see how this horrific attack on children provided insight on the topic of immigration. It was the evening of September 3rd, 2004, when I heard a radio news program reported that gunfire and explosions had occurred at school number 1 in Beslan, Russia. Yes, I remember. What a horrible attack. In negotiations with authorities, the Islamic terrorists threatened to kill 50 hostages. The morning after the Beslan horror, I contacted a local school district to see if it were possible to give American school children an opportunity to show their compassion. I applaud Representative Tancredo's work here. He did great service in visiting the victims. Saturday afternoon, we landed in Moscow, those of us who had made the previous trip to Russia. Saturday night, September 18th, the Russian press has interviewed us on that. Sunday afternoon, we saw a severely injured 16-year-old boy lying. Monday morning, September 20th, getting to the airport was unbelievably difficult. Yes, it was good of you to visit, but why is this chapter in this book? And finally, as if to underscore the horror that I had witnessed in Beslan, a news story a few weeks after I returned to the States reported that 25 suspected Chechen terrorists had entered the country from Mexico. Mm, 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 huh. A second U.S. official said the report is being investigated, but said it could not be determined whether the group of Chechens actually entered the country. We don't know whether or not that report is true, the official said. That's it. That's the whole connection. That's the only mention of immigration. That's why this chapter is in this book. I don't blame people for being scared of terrorism. It's scary. It can make you buy into the idea of Fortress America! We're a fortress, you see, on a military campaign, and outside is a besieging army constantly sending spies and saboteurs to our gates, and so the proper way to counter them is to guard our walls. But the truth is, America is not a fortress. It's an integrated part of the world economy, with both citizens and foreigners entering and leaving constantly, and thank goodness for that freedom. A very tiny sliver of this traffic is due to immigration. This is why I am entirely unmoved by arguments presented by, for example, Mark Krikorian in his chapter, National Security, Safety in Lower Numbers, where he emphasizes how overwhelmed our visa granting and border checks are, and suggests that this is an argument for further restrictions on immigration. But even if the United States outlawed all immigration, from anywhere, for any reason, it would lower the number of visas issued by about 5%, and the number of border crossings by less than 0.5%. Even if our visa application process were so fantastically airtight that no visa was ever issued to someone who would overstay and remain in the United States, it would lower the number of visa entries by less than 2%. Blaming our already restricted immigration levels for the high number of border crossings is the numerical equivalent of blaming blue-eyed, left-handed students for overpopulated schools. This kind of direct line of blame sounds completely silly when applied to any other aspect of the 9/11 terrorists. It's like trying to explain the world we live in to an overly naive, rambunctious child.
In other words, tell me about the 9/11 hijackers.
Well, they almost all got in on tourist visas.
Tourist visas! Well, that settles it. We need a complete moratorium on the tourists. No more tourists until the war on terror is won.
No, buddy, we obviously aren't going to stop tourism.
Well, at least heavily restrict it.
No, we aren't going to do that either. Tourism is an elephant. Tourists are good for the economy, and it's 1 in a million of them that's a terrorist. We aren't going to stop millions of people from entering the country just because they belong to the same broad group as some terrorists did. That would be silly.
Well, what other groups did the terrorists belong to?
Most of them were from Saudi Arabia.
Aha, that's it! No more visas for Saudi Arabia! Shut it down completely! We can't tell who's guilty and who's innocent, so stop them all!
No, buddy, we aren't going to do that either.
Then stop most travel from Saudi Arabia.
No! Saudi Arabia is an elephant. The government is an important ally, it's quite wealthy. We get a lot of business travel from Saudi. Most of our travel from Saudi Arabia is perfectly law-abiding. And you don't just make a blanket restriction on all this travel just because the terrorists happen to be from Saudi. That's just fear and prejudice. Nobody would seriously suggest that.
What about Mexican day laborers?
Ooh, now there's a goat. Someone who was merely unreasonably prejudiced against Muslims might point out that Canada has a much larger Muslim population than Mexico by millions, and a much less secure and longer border with the United States.
Restrict immigration from Canada!
And that border was emphasized by the 9/11 Commission report. By just about any measurable means, a terrorist is much more likely to come through the Canadian border than the Mexican border. As Jason R. Riley discusses in his book, smugglers can afford a decent chance of their couriers being caught, detained, fingerprinted on the southern border, as long as enough smuggling still makes it through. But a terrorist wouldn't want to risk their one shot with a 1 in 4 chance of being apprehended. Mr. Riley was even able to make the very risky statement in 2008 that, quote, "So far, no terrorist attack has been perpetrated by someone who sneaked into the United States through Mexico. This pattern continues to hold true to this day." Obviously, this isn't meant to say that no such attack will ever happen, or that the U.S. Mexico border is somehow immune to terrorism. It is only to show that if a proposed solution is obviously silly, ineffectual, or unreasonable for stopping terrorists on the Canadian border, it is doubly so for the Mexican border. Historically, of course, foreign terrorists enter the United States through neither border, but rather on tourist, student, or business visas.
Restrict business visas!
This lack of terrorist southern border crossers sometimes prompts restrictionists to broaden the search term. Lots of people get stopped, say, for sharing the same name as someone on a high-risk database. So don't count arrests or convictions. Count apprehensions. Don't count terrorists. Count confirmed or suspected terrorists. Hundreds of possible terrorists.
Who's really crossing our border? Hundreds of possible terrorists.
There are people who have come across our southern border illegally, and one wonders whether some of them are coming in here to commit acts of terror.
Yeah, one wonders. Another phrase for casting a wide net is looking for people from, quote, countries known to harbor terrorist sympathies. In his book, Representative Tancredo uses this phrase when he cites the statistic that 51 people from countries known to harbor terrorist sympathies were intercepted by the Border Patrol in 2005.
Oh, horror!
Hey, how many visitor visas were issued to these countries that same year? 85,000. In the 6-month transition from 2017 to 2018, 41 confirmed or suspected terrorists in the CBS's terrorist screening database were apprehended at the southern border.
Oh, horror!
How many of these were immigrants? 6. How many of them were arrested? 0. How many non-citizens in this database were apprehended at the Canadian border? 41. How many apprehensions from other sources away from either border? Over 3,500. But surely, even if there isn't much terrorist activity on the border, isn't it still best to focus on the southern border? Isn't any effort appropriate? Given the fact that terrorists have no qualms about killing children, what precautions are not appropriate? What is it exactly that we shouldn't do to protect ourselves? I'm glad you asked that. When it comes to security measures, it can often feel like there are no downsides. What does it matter if targeting immigrants is a very bad way of chasing terrorists? Shouldn't it be done anyway, just to cover all our bases? But the tragedy of this approach is that all efforts on ineffective work take away from effective work. There is a price from a security perspective for focusing anti-terrorism efforts on immigration. It takes away enormous resources from much better uses of our time. J.D. Hayworth's book even includes this one shockingly ironic quote. What if another 9/11 happens and I'm responsible? What if the bastards come across here in Arizona and I don't catch them because I'm so busy chasing a busboy or a gardener that I don't have time to do my job, my real job, catching terrorists? Remember, J.D. Hayworth uses this as an argument that we should be spending more efforts on illegal immigration. You know, because terrorism. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this is that if we said, for the sake of argument, that the U.S. Mexican border is where we should be spending our anti-terrorism efforts, immigration restrictions are still counterproductive. It's true that there are many illegal travel routes through the southern border of the United States and organized efforts to push traffic through these routes. The reason these routes are profitable to cartels and smugglers that run them is because there is an enormous population of job seekers and family members who are prohibited from coming in through the border checkpoints. The most nefarious uses of these routes, like drug smuggling, human trafficking, and sure, let's say terrorism, are masked by the much larger flow of economic migrants. We could drain these routes, remove these funds, and strip away this mask, if only these low-skilled workers came through our checkpoints instead. Rather than sneaking across the border, potential laborers would have every incentive to report their arrival at the border. This alone would make those looking to cross undetected conspicuous in their attempt at stealth, and more readily detectable by Border Patrol agents freed up to deter activity that is actually criminal. So I have good news for those of you who believe that the high amount of illegal immigration on the U.S. Mexican border puts us in mortal danger. We could shift a great portion of this traffic to be under government surveillance, able to be searched, counted, maybe even registered or charged a fee, making a more secure border, drastically cutting down the number of untracked border crossings. But this would require allowing more people to legally enter the country, and for restrictionists, even in the name of border security, this is too high a price to pay. At the beginning of each story in the Book of Virtues, there is a small note on the moral of the story. The one for the leopard's revenge reads as follows. Courage involves knowing what to fear, but that in itself is not enough, as this African folktale reminds us. The father leopard of this story may be circumspect, but his taking revenge on a weaker, innocent party is hardly courageous. Thank you for your time.